Good afternoon. My name is Karen West, and I'm the Director of Events for Book Passage. And we're streaming to you from Lagunitas out by Point Reyes in California. If you're new to Book Passage and you've come to us because of the excellent talent that we have today speaking, I wanted to let you know that Book Passage is an independent bookseller that's been in business for close to 45 years. We have two locations in Corte Madera in Marin County and the San Francisco Ferry Building, historic building. If you haven't been there, you must. It is a destination. Both stores are open. We launched this virtual series to keep you company during the pandemic, and there's a whole array of events awaiting you on our website and on YouTube. So I hope that you will flip through it, look at it as a library for you to hear some of the most interesting people of our time, speaking to the books that they've written in this last year. And I feel extremely excited about this event today. We have two top shelf journalists with us. Jason Dearen is an award-winning journalist who's written a book called Kill Shot. And I dare say it reads more like a Tom Clancy, Lee Child, Stephen King thriller than it does actual nonfiction. But it really does explore the dark underbelly of the pharmaceutical industry and what is known as compounding. And I think a lot of you won't know this story. When you read it, you'll be shocked. You'll also be informed, and you'll probably live a better life for learning what you're going to learn from Jason. It is a terror in a microbe, which we've all learned through the pandemic. But what can appear in your medications, if you aren't wary and don't have the knowledge, it can ruin your life and lead to dying. So it's a very, very important book. And he takes it on with great clarity. And it's a rip-roaring read, I will say that. He is joined by James Nestor, who has the book Breath Out, which if you don't know about it, you should know about it. He does a global exploration of something we take for granted every day of our lives, the simple act of breathing. And most of us are doing it wrong. And if we can just make these adjustments, our whole life and health can change. He again started out as a journalistic effort, really went all over the world and went in a cultural, sociological, and anthropological manner, but gave us a book that changes your life. I think these two are going to be riveting together. So please join me in welcoming Jason and James. I leave it to you, gentlemen.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was an awesome intro, Karen. I appreciate it.
So Jason, let's get right into it here. I have read this book, but a lot of people haven't yet. And so let's orient them as to what it's about, starting with what compounding pharmacies are. I had never heard of these things before I read your book. So why don't you give us a little background on that?
Sure. So compounding pharmacies in a nutshell are small-time drug makers that make customized drugs. And they're supposed to be made for an individual prescription. So one prescription, one patient, one drug. And that's the way the system's set up, so that if you have special needs, you need a drug that's stronger or weaker than the commercially available version, or you have, an allergy and you need something taken out of a particular medication, a compounding pharmacist will mix that drug up for you and make a customized version of it. And that's the way the system's supposed to work, is one prescription, one patient, one drug. So in a nutshell, that's what a compounding pharmacy is and what it's supposed to be.
Well, that sounds great. Why are these a bad thing? As I learned, other people may not know this. That sounds like a wonderful, very valuable service to a lot of people, especially those with allergies who don't want a bunch of other stuff in their prescriptions. How is this a bad thing?
So compounding pharmacies are a good thing. They should be a good thing. Unfortunately, our country does not have any federal oversight of these businesses. And so what you see is a kind of a loophole in our drug safety laws. And it's helpful to step back a little bit to kind of understand what compounding pharmacies do for us in the overall picture of our drug pipeline. There are kind of two buckets of how drugs are made in this country. One is the big pharma makers who make drugs like the vaccines we're all talking about right now, and many other drugs under strict FDA oversight. And that means that the drugs are made in factories that are inspected by FDA inspectors and that have millions of dollars of investment in safety upgrades and oversight. And that's one bucket. The other bucket is compounded drugs. And that's made in these compounding pharmacies. And And so with compounding pharmacies, what we know about them now is that there are 7,500 of them operating in the United States. A vast majority of those are not inspected by FDA inspectors. We don't know even if they're regularly inspected by state inspectors, because many of the states who are in charge of oversight of these places don't have enough inspectors to go into them. There's thousands of them, like I said. Most states have just a few pharmacy inspectors, and many of those inspectors aren't trained to even go in to these very sophisticated laboratories and even know what they're seeing. And so there's just a big gap in oversight. And so a lot of drugs are being made, frankly, with no eyes on them at all.
So what could possibly go wrong? You've got 7,000 compounding pharmacies making drugs per order, making mass amounts of quantities of these with no oversight. I guess that was a prelude to what your book is about. So why don't you tell us how you got into this subject and what the main drive of this book really is surrounding the New England Compounding Center?
Yeah, sure. So when I first started looking into this issue in 2017, I was taken by this federal murder trial that was happening in Boston. These two pharmacists were on trial for murder. Pharmacists on trial for murder. It was just fascinating to me. So I started looking into it. And what I uncovered, every layer of the story was more incredible than the next. And so these two pharmacists were on trial for a terrible fungal meningitis outbreak that occurred in 2012. And that happened all around the country. 17,000 vials of contaminated steroids were shipped from Massachusetts to 23 different states, 76 different clinics, and some 14,000 patients were exposed. People began showing up at hospitals in Tennessee, Michigan, Indiana, all around the country with meningitis, and the doctors couldn't figure out the source of the meningitis. It was a total mystery. So then I started getting interested in, well, how did they find out what was going on here? And once I got into the medical investigation, the medical detectives, I realized that the story was not only just an amazing, gripping story, but that it led to something that was really important that I needed to shine light on, which was the world of these compounding pharmacies that were shipping drugs around the country with such little oversight that something like this could even happen in the first place.
How does someone get meningitis from a steroid shot? How does that work?
Well, if there's a contaminant, so meningitis is basically inflammation of the central nervous system. That's in a nutshell. I'm obviously not a doctor, but that's what it is. And it can be caused by the two main ways that it's caused usually are through a bacterium or a virus. And so when these patients started showing up, they were looking for a bacterium and a virus, and all the cultures were coming back negative because there wasn't a bacterium, there wasn't a virus. What happened was these drugs were contaminated with a fungal pathogen, a fungus, a mold. And that mold got into the vials, it was sucked up into the syringe and injected through the body's defense mechanisms, the skin and all the other, kind of protections that our bodies have to keep these molds that are freely available in the environment. Mold exists, we breathe it in all the time, and our body usually takes care of it. But when it's injected through all those defense systems directly into a very sterile, unprotected area of the body, the spine, the spinal column, this mold, which had never been known to live there, it wasn't in any medical literature, found a home and began to thrive. And in these patients, not only did they get meningitis, many suffered from stroke because the fungus, once it kind of reached a beachhead inside the body and started growing, it spread towards the brain because it loves iron. It was an iron-hungry microbe, and blood contains iron, and the brain was the closest blood-rich environment. And so a lot of these patients started suffering strokes. So doctors on the ground were seeing these mysterious meningitis cases, and then people started having these weird deep brain strokes and dying. And meantime, they're trying to figure out what's going on, and that's kind of the narrative story in my book, is kind of how these medical detectives at CDC and in the States figured out what was happening, that this was a man-made pathogen.
So a patient would go into a clinic, go into a doctor's office, get a steroid shot for what? for like an aching back, or who would get a steroid shot?
That's exactly right. So pain management in our country is a huge, huge business. And opioids, which are a scourge, for so many, are a big way that this is dealt with. But many people don't want opioids, or they have jobs that require them to not be on opioids. So construction workers, people who work in the auto industry in the Midwest, things like, you can't be working a line or with machinery and be on opioids. So that's where steroid injections come in. So you have these pain clinics popping up all over the country where people can go in and in 20, 30 minutes, get an epidural steroid injection, an actual injection right into your spine with steroids, which stops the inflammation, and they're remarkably effective. But if a contaminant gets into those shots, as we saw in this case and in others since, it can be deadly. And it's at the very least, even if you don't die from it, some wish they had, because their lives are just ruined. They were already people with pain, and now they're living with all of these other, kind of complications from these infections. And so it's really just a terrible situation. And many of the victims in the book that were lucky enough to survive this are still living with the legacy of this terrible event from, nearly 10 years ago.
So I had always, when I read about that, I had always assumed that if I went into a doctor's office or you go and get surgery, that all of these drugs are certified. They are very carefully analyzed. And I was shocked to find that that isn't the case. There's literally zero oversight over so much of the drug supply. And we are just relying on the honesty of these very aggressive compounding centers to do their due diligence, which, as you found, they do not.
Yeah. And, James, it's also, when I talk to doctors, some of the first things I did when I started reporting this book, I couldn't believe this story. And I was like, maybe this is a one-off event. Maybe this is just something, that happened once. I started just calling doctors, people who treated these patients and others, and said, do you know if a drug that you're prescribing is FDA approved, or if it's compounded? And most of them said no. They don't know, because it's their job is, to diagnose the problem and figure out how to try to treat it, right? And so the pharmacists at hospitals and clinics are usually in charge of dealing with the procurement or of medicine. And so unless you're dealing directly with the pharmacist, you're not knowing. The doctors think everything that's coming into them that they're prescribing to their patients is safe. And some hospitals have wonderful processes and systems in place to ensure that they're not getting sketchy compounded drugs. But unfortunately, that's not the case for many, many other places, and especially clinics, these pain clinics around the country. And a big reason for this, if you step back a little bit, a big reason why these drugs even exist, why we need them, is because of drug shortages. So compounding pharmacies that make injectable high-risk drugs, the steroids we're talking about here, they also make drugs that are injected into the heart, called cardioplegia, for drug surgeries, and eye injections. So these are three of the big compounded drugs. And the reason that those drugs are compounded is because it's starting in the mid-2000s, we started to see a lot of shortages of these drugs. And it's a complicated economic picture for why that is, but a main thing is that 80% of the chemicals used to make these drugs are sourced from India, China, and other places overseas. So if anything disrupts those supply chains, there's a problem with supply. And so that's when, and hospitals still need them, patients still need them. So doctors will turn to compounding pharmacies. The FDA allows compounding pharmacies to step in case of shortage. And we've had shortages of these drugs now going on 15, 16 years, regular shortages, to come in and make these drugs. And so you saw a huge business growth opportunity in the mid-2000s, thousands and thousands of vials and doses of drugs that were needed, and compounding pharmacies like NECC, the one I write about in this book, and many others have stepped in and started mass producing drugs. Even though they're supposed to have that one patient per prescription, they found loopholes around that. They started doing something called backfilling, which is sending bulk amounts of drugs to the hospitals and getting the names afterward. or just making up names. So in this case, we had names on prescriptions like, Mickey Mouse, Tom Brady, Filet-O-Fish, and that is a pretty common occurrence that investigators will see in the documents, is that they'll just make up names so that it looks like they had a prescription in a cursory glance.
So let's talk about a little bit about the main compounding center at the center of your book. Was
Sure.
this a real bare bones operation, or was this an operation that had been around for a long time who had been doing this?
So they started in the late 1990s as a really small operation that was just making, kind of very small quantities of drugs. It wasn't until those drug shortages I just mentioned that the owner, Barry Cadden, saw an opportunity to make a whole lot more money and began hiring an aggressive sales force, kind of like you see with Big Pharma. We know Big Pharma has these fleets of salespeople that go out and pressure doctors into using drugs or give them, sweetheart deals to use their products. They started modeling their behavior on Big Pharma, even though they were supposed to be pharmacies making small quantities of customized drugs. And you saw the growth of NECC in about 2007 till 2012, when this happened, double and triple in profits. They became, someone that sold about $5 to $7 million of drugs a year. But when the time they went under, they were up near $70 million a year. And that was only half of that year. So they were on a rocket ship trajectory up in profits. And they were but one of these types of businesses. We know out of the 7,500 estimated compounding pharmacies, but because their lobbyists have been so good in keeping them from having to register or report anything that they do to the federal government, that we actually don't know how many of these places exist. We don't know how many drugs they make. There's no way of knowing because no one's measuring that. The data isn't there. So NECC was one of an estimated 6,500, 7,500 compounding pharmacies operating in the United States. Of those, another estimated like some 1,500 to 2,000 are making these injectable drugs. And again, they're legally allowed to ship them across state lines. So you may have one state that has, a better safety system in place to oversee the compounding going on in their state. But if you have a state like Alabama or Florida, one of these that don't have very good pharmacy oversight, all they do is they set up shop in one of those states, and then they start shipping to other states. And the need for drugs the demand for these drugs is so acute that they find, willing customers all around the country.
So this main center, the New England Compounding Center, you're calling it NECC, was run by this larger than life character named Barry Cadden, as you mentioned. Was he just a really aggressive business person, or was this guy just bad to the bone to begin with?
He was somebody who had ambition to make his business the biggest of its kind in the country. He saw himself as a major pharma player in the country, and was going to do anything he could. Salespeople that I spoke with or that testified in later trials described the sales, kind of atmosphere as cutthroat. They were flying people all around the country to sell these drugs. They were bribing pharmacists at major hospitals to get their business so that they had their names on their client lists, which would lure in, smaller businesses. So you had like Brigham and Women's Hospital. You had Massachusetts Eye and Ear, which is a teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School. And major hospitals were buying from these places. And we know now that they were bribing at some of these hospitals. They were bribing people, and they were doing anything they could to get their drugs in the door. And unfortunately, too many hospitals and clinics, believed his claims of having a top-notch, sterile clean room that could make these under the strictest sterility standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why don't you describe? I was blown away by how sketchy this place was, where they were producing these drugs that were going to be injected into people's spines or their eyes or their hearts. You mentioned that this was on some back alley near a bar that opened at 11 a.m. Why don't you describe a little bit of the scene?
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable because, like I said before, there was no oversight of this place. FDA wasn't going in there, and the state, when this event in 2012 happened, the state hadn't been in years for an inspection. And so when they finally killed people and got regulators to respond to them, what they found when the investigators pulled into the parking lot, they saw a huge pile of old mattresses and furniture with a mechanical shovel tearing into it and dust flying up everywhere. Turned out that this clean room, the sterile room, was operating next to a recycling plant. So that was number one. Then when they got inside, they found evidence of mold throughout the facility. They found evidence of mold on vials of drugs that were just sitting around that hadn't even been shipped out yet. They found, after interviewing the technicians who worked there, that technicians regularly saw ants, mice, hairballs, and all manner of, just gross stuff inside these rooms that are supposed to be sterile, and that were making drugs that were going to be injected into people's bodies. And again, this is what you see again and again in these types of facilities when they're not regularly inspected. And unfortunately, that's still the case today. That's still the kind of the legal regime that we have in this country for these facilities.
Hmm. So how did they get busted? What was the final thing that really alerted the CDC that something very, very wrong was going on here?
Sure. So like most of these types of cases, unfortunately, it came after people started dying. And so in 2012, like I mentioned earlier, these patients just start showing up with mysterious form of meningitis. They're having these terrible strokes. And we're not talking like 12 patients, like a cluster of cases in one place. This ended up being some 850 infected people, more than 100 died. And for 2 weeks, they were meticulously investigating the supply chains for each of the medical products used on these patients. Because again, they couldn't figure out the source. So maybe it's a contaminated injection. Maybe it was a lidocaine shot. They all were back pain sufferers, all had gotten these steroid injections. So they narrowed it down. So when they trace it about, a little more than a weekend, they trace it to the steroid to New England Compounding Center. And they call Barry Cadden, the man we were just talking about, and ask him, hey, is there anything that's going on there that you think could cause some contamination in your products? And he said no. And he assured them on the phone, and this is investigators with the CDC, Tennessee State Department of Health, serious medical investigators are calling this guy. And he's saying, no, it's fine. We are the cleanest, most sterile place that you could ever get. It's just top notch. We're the Ferrari of compounders, he called it. We are a Rolls Royce. He said, that's how he talked. He said things like that. And so they trace it there, but for weeks, because this guy's not telling them that they found mold in the room, his own monitoring of the room had found mold hits. It's in the records that come out after this terrible tragedy. And he doesn't tell them about it. And so for weeks, people are dying, and the medical investigators basically have to do the work and use science to figure it out. And ends up becoming, they trace the microbe in these people's body via DNA to these vials of drugs, but that took weeks. And then, after they finally were able to get that information, a criminal investigation was launched in 2013.
Yeah, you mentioned one part that really stuck out to me was that if you're going to have a clean room, it has to be under a certain level of humidity. I think it was 50%, and it has to be very cold, to around 60 degrees or around there, 60, 70 degrees. And you were mentioning that the air conditioning kept going off in this place in the summertime. And so it was not only extremely humid, but it was extremely hot, which is basically just a breeding ground for funguses. And they were fully aware of this and still didn't do anything and kept shipping drugs out to pharmacies and hospitals, well aware that they were likely aware that they were shipping stuff that was not clean. And that's what was just mind blowing. Meanwhile, this guy is buying what, $4 million houses, vacation houses. I don't want to give away too much of the book because you got to read the book, everybody. But I was flabbergasted by Cadden's cavalier attitude, saying that the CDC had a bone to pick with him, and they were just, looking into his practice, and he was doing everything just fine, above board, which was obviously not the case.
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes down to when you let businesses regulate themselves. These are the types of things that happen. Like we said at the top of this, compounding exists for a reason. Patients need these drugs, and they also need them not to be made in clean rooms with mice and mold running around, right? And so, right, these sterile rooms, they were making injectable drugs in. They would turn the air conditioning off overnight to save money. And they had temperature monitors in there that actually kept records, which I have and was able to verify this. And it would shoot up, to 80s, 90s. And sometimes it would get over 100 degrees in these places. And all of the drugs are stored in there on shelves as well. And there's strict climate control regulations for these types of things. Yeah, when you walk into any clean room, which I did, reporting this book, I went to many clean rooms to see how they should operate. And one of the first things you notice when you walk into them is the chill in the air. They are kept not freezing, but cool. And there's also an airflow requirement that keeps the air moving and pushing out of the room so that you're not getting contaminants sucking into the room. And so when you turn off the air conditioning in an environment like this, all of those protections cease. And unfortunately, you have something like this. And, another big question I asked myself was this just one bad actor? Or are there other? And I was able to pretty easily find, since 2012, a number of smaller outbreaks and clusters of deaths and injuries caused by very similar types of contaminated drugs, including, some 75 people blinded or partially blinded from contaminated eye injections in the Dallas area, babies who were overdosed because a compounding pharmacy made morphine injections for these babies too strong, and babies in Chicago and Indianapolis needed Narcan because they'd been overdosed with an opiate. There's many more examples. It's an ongoing issue.
So we have a couple of questions here I'm going to ask you, but the first thing I want to mention is, want to be clear that some of these compounding agencies, pharmacies, have volunteered to be certified by the FDA, right?
Right.
So this is a movement that's starting. The ones that are professional, that are actually doing their jobs, want to distinguish themselves from these ones in a back alley, behind a donut shop, with a bunch of dirty flea-ridden mattresses. So I guess that the question is, how do we distinguish between a good one and a bad one? And I also want to make clear to people, this is not Dearen, he can speak for himself, but we're not bashing on all compounding pharmacies. They serve an absolute purpose, but they have to do their job right when they're having their stuff injected into people's bodies. So here's a question from Leslie Akoka. Or do you want to respond to that, Mr. Dearen? And then I'll ask you a question.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, the problem with this is not that there aren't good compounding pharmacies out there. There are. The problem is that the oversight system for compounding pharmacies isn't such that if you get a compounded drug, you can have the same level of surety that you can with an FDA-approved drug. You just don't know. So if you want that information, you have to ask, you have to research, which with an FDA-approved drug, FDA oversight isn't perfect either, but it's surely so much safer than no oversight at all. And when I get a drug that's FDA approved, I take it willingly and I feel confident about it. A compounded drug, because of the regulations, the way they are, it's hard to know the good actors from the bad actors unless you ask questions. And that information is out there, you can get it, but it's a kind of a buyer beware situation. And that's not the safest system under which to operate when you're injecting medicines into your body.
Speaking of which, here's a question by Leslie here. Says, I will never get medication from a compounding pharmacy again. How do we know that MDs and hospitals are what they are giving us? So I guess this gets into more of the specifics. What do you do if you're about ready to go in and get eye surgery or to get a steroid injection? You know, do you have to spend 2 weeks digging up where these drugs came from? Is there a quicker way of getting this information that's reliable?
Unfortunately, it does take a little bit of work. I had a registered pharmacist who inspects compounding pharmacies for a living, design a series of questions that are at the end of my book. So you can go, if you don't want to buy it, you can go to the library and look up that information. But
buy it, everyone. Buy it.
Please buy it. But
great.
no, but yes. The other thing is some hospitals won't work with these outside compounding pharmacies, right? That aren't the ones that aren't FDA approved, or they say they won't. Unfortunately, you have to ask them about that, and you have to press them a little bit on it. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, a few years back, I got this through a Freedom of Information Act request. It wasn't readily available. I had to dig this out of the government. They actually did a survey of hundreds of hospitals in the United States, asking them if they're only using these new FDA, by the way, these FDA approved compounding pharmacies, there's like 76 of them out of 7,500. So they're great. And if they're called outsourcing facilities. It's a new category and I won't get into that, but they're great. But there's 76 of them. There are thousands of compounding pharmacies that are not signing up to be under FDA oversight. So you have to ask your hospital whether they use them. So anyway, the HHS report found that out of the hundreds of hospitals they surveyed, and these were surveys, they weren't compelled by a subpoena to answer these questions. Dozens of these hospitals freely admitted that they still use non-FDA supervised compounding pharmacies. They have no other choice. They need the drugs. They need these drugs and they're in short supply. Steroids, especially betamethasone, a steroid that has been in the news over the last year because it's been found to help COVID patients. What happened when that demand went up? It went on the shortage list. FDA keeps a list of drugs that are in shortage. When a drug goes on that shortage list, compounders can legally make it. And any of the oversight that FDA tried to improve after this terrible event I write about in the book has also been mostly suspended because of the emergency situation we're in with COVID. Mm-hmm. So now we have compounding pharmacies who don't have strong oversight to begin with in most states, making drugs for COVID patients, and the FDA is allowing it to happen and relaxing even the light standards it had on compounding.
So there's really
because of the COVID emergency.
There's really no way for us to know if we're getting a bona fide drug from a bona fide compounding pharmacy. It's unless you do all of that digging, which how many people are going to do that? Or
if your hospital tells you, we don't buy from these folks, and you you trust that they're telling. And if they tell you that, that's great. I mean, where I lived in Florida, the University of Florida Hospital doesn't use outside compounding. They invest and do their own compounding. So you're getting compounded drugs, but you're going to get them from the hospital's pharmacists, and they are subject to much stricter standards because it's inside a hospital. So if they're doing their own compounding, that's a much different thing than if an outside compounder is doing it.
I want to welcome people to ask questions here. You can send questions in and we will get them here on through the magic of the internet, and I will ask them of Mr. Dearen. In the meantime, let's talk about these victims. How many people died, or maybe we'll let people read the book, but what is the status? Have these people been compensated for some reason or in some capacity? Or if not, why?
Well, there were so many victims, hundreds of people were infected. Others who got injections and didn't get an infection, but were exposed to it, were also qualified as victims in the cases. NECC filed for bankruptcy immediately after this. They were shut down. So they were shut down after this happened, and they filed for bankruptcy. As you can imagine, hundreds of lawsuits were filed, not only against them, but against the medical providers. Because of the bankruptcy situation, the money was pooled, the cases were all pooled. And long story short, they were pooled into one big case called a multi-district litigation. Some victims received a decent amount of money. Others I went and talked to who lost their loved ones had received a couple $1,000s, still hadn't received much because the insurance companies, the health insurance companies, also were filing claims on that because they were covering all these victims who were in the hospital for weeks and needed all these surgeries, and they wanted to be recouped that money as well. And so it wasn't only the victims who were, injected and lives ruined, family members who died. They weren't the only ones laying claim on this money. There were a lot of other quote unquote victims, including the hospitals claimed to be victims. The doctors claimed to be victims because they said NECC lied to them. So some got some settlements, but a lot of them didn't. And I know many who are still waiting for money because of the health insurance claims on it.
And this happened about 10 years ago.
About 10 years ago. And by the way, they can't work anymore either because their bodies had been completely ruined by this.
Messed up. Here's the next question by disgusted voter, all one word, no space between the D and V on that one. What's your take on thiopental, I hope I pronounced that correctly, compounding or for lethal injection?
Oh, I know what this is. So Big Pharma some years ago, the big pharma companies, when I say big pharma, I mean like Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, the big gigantic GlaxoSmithKline, these big companies. They decided to not provide drugs to states for executions anymore. So who did states turn to get those drugs? Compounding pharmacies. So compounding pharmacies have been making the drugs that states like, unfortunately, as a correspondent in the Deep South in Florida for many years, I was the Associated Press's witness to executions in that state. And so I actually did some investigation into this. I will tell you that it's really hard to find out which compounding pharmacies are providing the drugs for the states because most states have an exemption to the Freedom of Information laws that exempt them identifying the executioner, and they're calling compounding pharmacies because they're making the drugs to kill the inmate. They're calling them the executioner, and so we can't actually find the names of it. So I know that is happening. It's that's what compounding pharmacies are there to do. When big pharma won't provide the drug, they're there to be a kind of a backup mechanism in the supply system, and that unfortunately is applying as well to lethal injections in this country.
Next question here from Katina Chuvansky. Do you think the previous administration, with its history of installing unqualified individuals to head up federal agencies, could have weakened inspections or let regulations go lax on these places?
Yes, the regulations were already lax. One of the really interesting kind of jobs for me in this book was to kind of contextualize all this. Why does this exist? How can this happen? Like politically, why don't we have a system for this? As a quick digression, I mean, in the 1930s, 103 children and others died from poisonous cough syrup made by a pharmacist. It's the elixir sulfanilamide disaster. There was so much national outcry over this terrible tragedy that FDR signed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It revolutionized drug safety and food safety in our country. It created the modern FDA oversight system, and it created big pharma. Pharmacists made most of our drugs before that, and all of a sudden we're sidelined in favor of manufacturers who are under FDA oversight. And that's where the carve out in the law for compounding came from. They said, well, we still need customized drugs, so we're going to let the pharmacist still, as long as they have a prescription, they can still make their things. After this disaster in 2012, you think the similar kind of thing would happen. More than 100 people died, hundreds sickened, people's lives ruined in multi-states. And they did pass a law called the Drug Quality and Security Act, but I go into deep kind of an investigation into that law into my book. And long story short, it was weakened by very effective lobbying from the compounding industry to be voluntary. So that's where we are still today. It's a voluntary system. And, sure, the last administration was, anti-big government. They set out to weaken every oversight agency from the EPA to the FDA. And they did that. So oversight surely was worse during the Trump years than it would have been during an administration that was more pro-regulation, pro-oversight. And that's, that's continued on. And some of these disasters that I mentioned earlier, the blindings in Texas, the overdoses happened during the Trump years.
So this book's making waves. You're getting a lot of traction right now. Have you gotten any responses from compounding pharmacies, good or bad?
I will say that I'm very pleased that the reaction from the industry has been positive. There are enough people who want this industry to have credibility, and credibility means a reputation that was ruined, frankly, by this event, And so I'm talking to one of those groups, a compounding safety group, on Monday. And other pharmacists have been writing me. The best part of I spent a lot of time researching this book, and I actually had, like I said, a registered pharmacist review it and make sure that the pharmacy information was accurate. I took a lot of pride and a lot of time to get that right. And so far, the compounding pharmacists that have reached out to me and have been happy that I got it right and want to see their industry last. And that's going to be through some sort of safety reforms, or at least, some sort of system that's put in place so that patients know compounding drugs are safe. And it's not some sort of guessing game or, a list of questions in the back of a book that you have to take with you to the doctor to ask if your drugs are safe. I mean, that's not the way this should work.
So you haven't been followed around by like a Ford Taurus with tinted windows or anything yet?
Not yet, but don't give them any ideas, Nestor.
Okay. Let's move on over to Peter Y. Wants to know, that's the letter Y. If supply chain issues disrupt availability from traditional sources, how do the compounders get their raw materials to fill the demand gap?
Sure. Well, so they stockpile them. Most of the industry is supplied by a big chemical company in Texas called the Professional Compounding Centers of America. I think I got that. It's PCCA. And they're basically, so they procure these chemicals for a lot of these drugs, and they keep them in stock. And then the compounders go and they buy the drugs in smaller allotments from them. Also, compounders, while they're helping bridge the gap in supply, they're not making the millions and millions and millions of doses that big pharma is. So when I talk about them having a supply chain disruption, we're talking about massive amounts of drugs. Compounders are there to try to bridge the gap until the supply chain disruption is cleared. But another reason, it's not only supply chain disruption. Sometimes drugs just aren't profitable enough for a Pfizer. We hear these stories all the time. They stop making a drug that patients need because it wasn't, or they're charging outrageous prices, for a drug because they can. I mean, it's no big secret that big pharma is a profit-driven enterprise like every other big business. And when a drug doesn't make enough money, they just stop making it. And so that doesn't mean patients don't need it. In step compounding pharmacies. And again, this isn't a book bashing compounding pharmacies. This is a book making an argument that we need these places, and so they should be safer.
Is there any other country where this can happen? Does this kind of thing happen in Europe? Does it happen in South America, in Australia, or do they have regulations set up that it can't happen?
Unfortunately, it happens all over the world. Compounding and, so, apothecaries, pharmacists making drugs is still a practice that all over the world. And I don't know, kind of every country's laws about this, but I do know, Australia, I see I have kind of a Google alert so that when compounding problems occur, I can read stories about it, things like that. I see issues all over the world from this, China, India, throughout Latin America, Australia. So yeah, it's a problem in other countries as well. And it's a similar situation. Big pharma covers the entire globe. But when there are shortages here, there are shortages everywhere. And so these types of companies are needed to come in and make it. Another part I didn't get into in the book very much, I kind of think to it is that, where do you think a lot of kind of pro athletes who take illegal supplements or steroids get these drugs? A lot of times they come from compounding pharmacies. You'll see in some of the big steroid scandals, like the Balco scandal. Balco was like a chemistry lab, but it was a compounding pharmacy. Same with A-Rod and his steroid scandal in Florida was tied to a compounding pharmacy there. So because of the lax oversight, these places are involved not only just in adverse events on patients like I'm writing about, but all sorts of fraud and other kind of criminal dealings too. So you see a lot of crime around these places.
Another question here. Who do we ask to strengthen oversight and inspections on drug makers? Do you ask the FDA? Do you ask Congress? What would you do?
Well, right now, the FDA doesn't have the legal oversight to do much about it. They can go in only after somebody's died. They're reactive, not proactive. So your state, if you're going to buy something from a compounding pharmacy, your state has a board of pharmacy. That board of pharmacy is in charge of making sure those drugs are safe.
Okay. And you mentioned that some states have better boards, tighter restrictions. California seems to be better than like Alabama.
Sure.
In many ways, I might add. But
better
not
served,
only
that's
that.
for sure.
So I guess you would start by looking at the restrictions or requirements in your state and then work down from there. So would you write a letter to your state senator? Would you write? So that's who you should go to then.
Yes. Okay. So you can do that. I mean, really, the key here is if you want federal oversight, start writing letters to your congressmen and your senators, right? This is an issue that Congress has for years tried to take up, but the compounding pharmacy lobby has successfully beaten back. So you can try that. Unfortunately, I can't really give you much good news here. You can go to your state pharmacy board. You can, in California, go to them. They do a much better job, like you said, than a state like Florida or Alabama or something in oversight. But unfortunately, if a hospital or a clinic needs a drug and wants to get it cheaper or from another supplier from out of state, they can still do that in a lot of cases. And even if it's kind of verboten or like against the letter of the law, nobody's tracking this stuff. So nobody knows whether they're doing it or not. I mean, there's just no oversight really of this interstate commerce. And FDA is still trying. There's a case right now going on. I won't bore you with legal details, but FDA is trying to come up with some sort of system to get a number of states to force reporting. How many drugs do you make in your compounding pharmacy? What drugs, just basic stuff, but that still won't apply to the whole country. As we know, a lot of states don't like the federal government getting involved in their business. And so as long as there's not some kind of federal mandate, it's going to be a patchwork system at best.
Okay. In the meantime, then, America open for business. That's what it sounds like to me. Okay.
That's right.
We have a question here from David Quatter, I think it is. What's next for Mr. Dearen?
Well, I mean, in about 10 minutes, probably a glass of scotch with some ice, I think, probably. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it ice or neat, but thank you for the question, David.
Thanks for the answer, Jason. Wasn't quite the answer we were expecting. Do you have another book in the works? Is that something you're picking at? You're back at the AP. Am I correct with that? Why don't you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah. I'm an investigative reporter at the Associated Press. I would love to write another book. This one just came out, so I'm pretty happy just kind of sitting with this one for a while. I'm really enjoying the reaction and conversations around this book. It's really fun to get out and talk about this. But also, the victims community who's still out there, they have, a lot of them, I've been able to interface with them either through reporting. Also, they have a Facebook group and talk to them. And so that's been really actually an unintended part of writing this book that I've really been enjoying, which is a lot of them have read it, some years have passed now. It's this terrible tragedy that they live with. And they've seen this book as shining light on this terrible thing. People just moved on, right? From these things. The next big news story, this is multi-news cycles ago. And this is shining a new light on that. And I've been hearing from at least some of them that they're getting a little bit of kind of closure or catharsis from it. And that's been really gratifying to me because, when you write a book like this and a large number of people were hurt by something, I worry that they're going to be affected by it, that the book would have some sort of negative effect on them. And that it hasn't seemed to happen. So that's been good. But yeah, as far as, I continue looking into compounding issues in my job at the Associated Press. There's a lot of territory to mine there. And I've got a lot of other projects coming up and hopefully some other book related news in the not too distant future as well.
So again, just to wrap up here, we're wrapping up. If anyone has any other questions, now's your time. So the thing to do, if let's say I'm set up to get a steroid shot and a local pain clinic, would you call them up? Like if you, how about instead of me, because you're the pro here, what does Jason Dearen do before he is injected with legal drugs at a pain clinic? What are the steps that you would take?
Well, the first question is just to ask, where is the steroid that you're injecting me coming from? Is it an FDA approved product? If the answer is yes, you're done. Right? That's an FDA approved product. You're fine. If the answer is this is a compounded product, it comes from a compounding pharmacy, there's a whole other list of questions that you need to ask. But that's a good place to start. I mean, just to keep it simple, just differentiating. Is this an FDA approved? Because most people before this book or before this conversation would have gone in and just thought this is an approved, safe product. So just knowing that that's not always the case is an important first step. And then from there, you can go and ask deeper questions. Again, I get into them in great detail at the end of the book. And I think it's really helpful to just start asking questions because unfortunately that's where we are. You shouldn't have to do that. You should just go and get and not worry about it, but you do have to worry about it. And you do need to ask questions. So that frontline question there, and then, just keep digging. If it's a compounded drug, ask, is it from an FDA approved compounder? What's the inspection? What are the do you guys have the inspection records for the compounding pharmacies? They should. That's something that they get from a reputable compounding pharmacy. They will send them their inspection, their state inspections. They have clean bill of health. And if they're not being inspected, then there's a problem. So you have to do a little of your own sleuthing.
Okay. So I guess the last question I have is, you're talking about scotch. What kind of scotch are you going to be drinking right after this in a couple of minutes?
I think it's going to probably a Lagavulin.
Okay. I'm surprised you could pronounce that because I certainly couldn't. I think that is it for us. Unless there are any parting words you would like to leave us with. I would like to say I was lucky enough to read an early copy of this book and it blew me away. And then I was lucky enough to read the new version where he really honed a bunch of these different threads. And I love this book. I highly recommend it. And I learned a lot. It made me super paranoid, which isn't good, but with knowledge comes some power. And so you have some power.
But then you learn how to breathe. And then you buy James Nestor's book, Breath, which will change your life and teach you how to breathe and make yourself healthier if you do get sick or to keep you from getting sick. So it's a twofer and you should buy them all from Book Passage.
And the snake eats its tail. And this is how our industry works, everybody. Thank you very much. Good night.
Night.
Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks, James.
I do think that this was absolutely a terrifying book, but I agree with what you said, James, that it is knowledge is power. And we can ask questions, we can stay healthier by examining these things. And I want those of you who are watching it, first of all, I want to say the people who sent in questions, those were amazing questions. They were really good. So thank you for participating in the hour with us. But I will say, if you want this sort of journalism to happen, both on breath and on something so critical to your health and well-being, you must support the journalists by buying their work when it's out in the world, and then support us, independent book selling. We cannot offer any of this, none of this works if you don't do your part. So please support us by purchasing both of these books. I hope you'll join us tomorrow at 6 o'clock when we have novelist Elizabeth Wetmore, who wrote the book Valentine, which was one of the best books of last year. It's out in paperback now, but that will be thrilling as well. To both of you, continue the good work, please. Important. You're changing people's lives. So thank you so much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Karen.
Jason.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.